This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students, alumni, and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional career that you're happy with. On this episode, I'm joined by Jonathan Azoff, tech industry veteran and general partner at SNØCAP, a VC firm that invests in early-stage, profit-oriented platforms that directly and indirectly solve the climate crisis. Jonathan is going to join me as a co-host for an upcoming mini-series of episodes featuring conversations with clean tech entrepreneurs. This episode and the upcoming series is made possible with support from SNØCAP. We thought a conversation with our friend Gabriel Scheer, the Director of Innovation for Mobility and Energy at ElementalExcelerator, would be a great preview. Gabriel recently returned from his first experience attending a COP28, and shares his perspective on this significant global event. We talked about some of the exciting new climate technologies represented at the expo, topics like blended finance and the role of nonprofits and venture capital, and nonprofit venture capital like ElementalExcelerator plays in the energy transition. Gabriel offers some advice for anyone looking for a career in the climate solutions space, especially the importance of informational interviews and networking to find your interests and niche. So whether you're an MBA student, a professional seeking a career with impact, or just interested in learning a little bit more about decarbonization and the energy transition, I hope you'll enjoy this conversation on careers and professional life with Gabriel Scheer. We're recording this episode on December 12th. Gabriel, welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you are a second-time guest on the podcast. We spoke about what you do, but give us just a high-level overview of what ElementalExcelerator is, what your role there is, and why were you at COP?
Happy to. Elemental is a nonprofit climate investor. We invest in climate tech companies globally. We have the fortunate position as a nonprofit to invest in companies focused on that impact. And we have a particular interest in investing in companies that have traditionally excluded founders and working on projects and funding projects in frontline communities. Now, to the COP side of things, it was my first time there. It was also our first time there. And I think, you asked about sort of what drew us there. And part of it was trying to understand, what is it to be there? What is it, what does COP entail? Is there a role for someone like us to play? We do have investments globally. We are thinking globally, but we're very much a US-based organization. And so I think part of it was a curiosity to understand what role we might play and what we might sort of bring to the conversation by going to COP.
And what role do you think you brought to that conversation this time
Great
around?
Question. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think your question leads to reflection, which is sort of what did I see and what did I learn there and how did we play into what I saw and learned? And I think one of the things that was really exciting to me about COP, and, having seen it from the outside in the past, I couldn't have told you a lot about what actually took place in the past, even though I'm, a follower of these kinds of things. Being there, what I saw was people from all over the world, from all sorts of different fields, nonprofit, for-profit, investors, banks, oil people, you name it, all in one spot, talking about this issue of climate change, which is an obvious thing that needs to happen, right? It is a global problem. We are a global humanity, and we need to be having this conversation globally. And you can obviously point to a lot of things that have been reported on that are clear problems with the process and problems with what's going on with COP28. On the other hand, I was incredibly heartened by the breadth of people there and the types of conversations we were a part of. And so to get back to your question of what did I find and what did we do, we engaged in a lot of different conversations in a lot of different venues. There were formal presentations, there were formal panels and so forth that we were a part of. I presented on one around blended finance, for example. There were others in which we simply were passive observers. And then there was the general expo itself, which is a massive place. It's the 2020 Expo site. Humongous site, which I understand is roughly the size of Central Park in New York. Lots and lots of things there to go see, experience, and learn about. There was everything from booths from specific places, for example, Masdar City, to booths from specific companies such as Microsoft, to startups, a huge variety of startups, particularly a number of startups from Breakthrough Energies Group. So just a huge variety of things to go learn about, people to talk to, things to do. And I think that the sort of overarching theme to me was simply the breadth of people, the breadth of ideas, all there focused on this one very significant real problem of climate change.
Gabriel, I'm so curious. Any event where there's sort of demarcated lines for people to have conversation creates interesting dynamics. I'm curious, while you were there, did you notice the blue zone and the green zone and and sort of and if you happen to transcend zones, did you notice different types of conversations, different types of people, kind of bringing different perspectives? What stood out to you?
Yeah, totally. So blue zone, you had to have a special pass to get into that. And it is a core part of the expo that I mentioned, this giant sort of place. So yeah, I saw that. I did not have a blue zone pass, so I was not able to go in there. But that is where the protests are being allowed. And again, we can touch on a lot of things around where this is being hosted and how it's all going down. But protesters are in there, obviously ministers and so forth, doing the negotiations are in there. The green zone is a huge area surrounding that. And the green zone for the first couple of days, I believe, was I don't actually know how you got the passes then. I wasn't there yet at that point. I know that, they were accessible to some, but I'm not sure to whom. While I was at COP, the green zone was widely available. You could go to the COP website and ask for passes for the green zone and get them and go. So I went to the green zone, I think 3 of the days that I was there, and it was, freely accessible. There were school groups, there were families, there were business people, there were all sorts of people walking through there. I would say the families I saw, based solely on appearances and guessing, probably were more local, meaning I can't imagine a tourist went from the United States to go to COP, but maybe I'm wrong. But there were families walking around, strollers and all sorts of stuff, people of all ages, people from all over the world. I mean, you heard so many languages and so forth. So to your point, Jonathan, I think the blue zone, yeah, I wasn't in there. I can't speak to what that was like. The green zone was, from what I saw, very inclusive. You could walk into a panel that was 4 C-level folks from different, organizations from all over the world, the leaders of a giant NGO, a giant corporate, a giant bank, whatever, all sitting on a panel, and you could walk in and listen in the green zone. It was awesome because you just got to hear so many perspectives, so many different approaches to this world that we're living in and this challenge we're all facing. So that to me was unbelievable. I walked into the Energy Transition Expo Hall, which is this very, very large building, and got to listen to some amazing presentations, again, by global level leaders. So that was cool. And that was something available, from what I could tell, to whomever was in there. Then I think the other side of this is outside of that expo place, which candidly is not in, for those who haven't been to Dubai, I had not been to Dubai before. The expo is a ways out. I took the metro, and it was from where I was, which was kind of the downtown central-ish area. It was over an hour on the metro. You could do the same thing in a cab or an Uber or something in about 25, 30 minutes, I think. But it's out there. It's really not convenient to anywhere. That said, lots of events were taking place, everywhere else in Dubai. So hotels, conference centers, whatever. There were lots of spaces where events were taking place, sponsored by somebody, put together by somebody. And again, it was lots of, tremendous opportunities to go learn from all sorts of fascinating people talking about all sorts of things. And, it was everything from I got to sit down on a conversation which Al Gore was talking about his version of COP and what should be happening. He was fiery, as he's been, in recent years, for those who pay attention to him. He was fired up.
Is that the conversation with Akshat Rathi? Was that the one Al Gore Akshat Rathi conversation?
No, the conversation
it's a fantastic episode of the Zero podcast. If folks haven't listened to it, Al Gore interviewed by Akshat Rathi live at COP28, and it was powerful. And you're right, he's fiery. He's really critical of the sort of governance process of the COP. And you get the history, which many people might not know, because the history goes back to 1996. I had no idea.
Yeah. I mean, when you really look at the history, we've known that this stuff needs to change for a long, long time. What Al Gore is doing, to me, is exactly what someone in his place should be doing. He's, unassailable at some level, right? He is a global figure who, you can love him or hate him, but at this point in his career, what does he have to lose? Somebody's got to call out truth to power in this sort of scenario. And the fact that, we need to fundamentally change. We need to stop drilling for oil, right? We need humongous change. And I think, again, I was talking to a friend who I ran into in the green zone. And as we were talking, he's like, honestly, I'm feeling a little down. Like you've seen the negotiations. They're not going where we'd like them to go. And we were talking, I was like, look, we didn't ever think this would be easy, right? Like the idea that the globe would suddenly just shift away from fossil fuels and go all renewable and all, low carbon or no carbon. That there was never a version where that was like, okay, we did it. Like flip the switch, we're done. And so to me, what we're seeing is exactly what we knew we would have to see, which is stop, push back from existing industries who have vested interest in the status quo. But then you need people like Al Gore out there at the front pushing and saying, I get how this works. I've been a part of it at the highest levels, and we've got to change. And you need someone like him out there doing that. So to your question, no, it wasn't that conversation, but it was another conversation similar to that. And he was fired up. And he was saying the right stuff, the stuff that, needs to be said, and from someone like him. So yeah, but back to it. I mean, to your question, Jonathan, there's the green zone, there's the blue zone, then there's the city in which all the rest of it happens. And there was so much going on. You really had, there's, and someone who struggles sometimes with FOMO, you had to constantly be deciding like, which thing that looks amazing and fascinating should I go to, especially since their chances are not next to each other. So, like 30-minute cab ride or something from this one to that one, or metro, which is, an hour plus from this one to that one. So like, you got to bet I'm going to go to this one or I'm not, but it was amazing. There were so many conversations. There were so many just really interesting people having interesting things.
It sounds like the experience of going to South by Southwest years ago, where you have the sanctioned events that are inside the convention center and at some of the main venues, and then you have all these other events going on all over Austin, and you want to be at all of them.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier that one of the things you were there talking about was blended finance. Could you explain the concept of blended finance and how ElementalExcelerator uses or participates in blended finance to bring solutions to market, so to speak?
Yeah, so happy to. Blended finance, as I understand it, I think there are lots of definitions of it, honestly, but as I understand it, it's a mix of different types of finance, as the words would suggest, that enable projects to move forward. And so one of the things that Elemental's been focused on for years is investing in early stage companies to try for specifically catalytic growth in those early stage companies. And what we've seen is that is really great. It is something that is core to a lot of money and other. And then there kind of happens to be a big gap. And that gap sort of persists after that first commercial deployment or so until a lot later when infrastructure funding comes in. Infrastructure funding often is building bigger things. Infrastructure funding can build things like bridges. It could build, lots of commercial scale deployments at scale. There's this kind of gap in between. And so blended finance often is a kind of combination of a lot of different forms of finance, everything from sort of project finance to debt, that could be venture debt or other types of debt, to just a variety of different funding sources that enable people to go from we did it once to we now are doing it at massive scale, at a sort of big picture level. And so we've been starting to play in that space. We've been working with a number of our portfolio companies to understand, first of all, what the gap is, and then second, to figure out how we can fill it. One of our companies, for example, Forum Mobility, is a company that came out of, or the founders rather, came out of the solar industry where they had been doing product development for solar. And in that capacity, understood project finance and understood how to create special purpose vehicles and attain funding that would enable them to both develop things at scale, but then manage those things in an interesting way while also continuing to develop more things at scale. So that's a company, like I said, we've been working with them in portfolio. We've also been working with a number of other companies trying to understand what are the gaps, what don't they know as they're trying to think about blended finance. So for example, it takes a fairly high level of financial sophistication. Do they have a CFO? If not, is there a fractional CFO or somebody else who could step in and really add that capacity and that knowledge base to companies? So those are just some of the ways we're thinking about blended finance and some of the things that need to happen. But ultimately, to sort of big picture address the question, there is a fair bit of early stage capital for a lot of climate tech companies. There's a fair bit of late stage capital, but there's a gap in between. And that gap requires filling with a lot of creative new funding mechanisms, some of which are completely unfamiliar if you're a tech startup person who knows how to get VC. you may not know how to go after banks, for example, that offer different kinds of project finance, or go after CDFIs and green banks and others who are really trying to figure out how do we fill that gap. And that's something we're working on.
Acronym alert, CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution.
Yep. Sorry about that.
Ding, 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 ding. That's fine. Gabriel and I worked together a long time ago, and some of the folks that we ended up working with were funded by CDFIs. So that's why I know the that acronym, but it might not be familiar to other people. So part of your job is to assess companies on their ability to grow and deliver solutions that address the climate crisis. Part of that is also understanding, what are the hot technologies that are actually going to move the needle. Is there anything you saw or learned while you were at COP28 that changed your view of the landscape over the next 3 to 5 years?
Changed my view is an interesting question. I think that if anything, it was sort of a doubling down of awareness that we've got to go bigger, we've got to go faster. And I am heartened by a lot of what I heard. I mean, I was in the room with sort of leading bankers who were saying, yeah, oil that's in the ground right now is going to have to get priced to zero. Like, we're going to have to acknowledge that oil can't come out of the ground. And if we do that, what does that do in terms of the valuation of big oil companies? But that's got to happen. And this, to me, it seems like one of those things of like, it's never going to happen, and then somebody's going to do it. And the second that happens, that some analyst somewhere actually writes the report that says, all the oil that's not yet been drilled is going to zero. Well, how does that change the world? How does that change how people look at oil companies and where they put their money? So I think there's a lot of that sort of thinking that to me came out of just the big picture nature. From a technology perspective, getting out of the US is interesting. In particular, I think a lot about energy and about mobility. In the US, I think a lot of the focus obviously has been on electric vehicles. And by that, I mean cars. In a lot of other parts of the world, it's smaller cars, it's 2 and 3 wheeled vehicles, and an awareness that we can't just build cars our way out of this. We have other things that have to happen as well. And that was on full display, talking to folks from Europe, talking to folks from Asia. Was really interesting to hear about that. It was not evident on the roads of Dubai. I saw some, standard American sized pickups and SUVs and so forth on the roads of Dubai, but talking to people from a lot of other regions was very evident that 2 and 3 wheelers are going to be a huge piece of this, particularly in places like Africa, actually. And then obviously small cars as well, like K cars out of Japan and various cars out of China already. On the energy front, I think, continued solar and wind are going to continue their sort of almost endless seeming march. Levelized cost of energy for both of those already, they're winning, right? They're winning. Storage is still a huge thing that needs to be solved for. I don't think there's one storage solution that solves all the problems, but I think there are a lot of storage solutions that get really interesting really fast. And I'm excited to see those continue to roll out. One of our portfolio companies, actually Energy Dome, had a big announcement while we were there that was really exciting, an investment or a grant rather from Breakthrough Energy Catalyst to deploy in Sardinia a large-scale commercial energy storage solution using compressed CO2. So really excited to see that and so many other projects continue to roll out. None of that's quite new to your question, but again, I think the sort of global resolve of we got to do this more, we got to do it bigger, we got to scale, we got to do it faster. That was really exciting to me.
I have a question for you, Gabriel, on that front. So just in terms of needing to do more, I mean, this COP did set a record, at least on paper, for commitment dollars.
Mm-hmm.
57 billion in the first 4 days committed through various institutions, none the least of which was Altera. I think that was a 30 billion commitment. And I started to look into it a little bit in terms of like how they're going to, deploy that amount of capital, let alone raise it. And I'm curious, in your time there, did you feel like that capital will make its way to things like the blended financial capital stack you were talking about earlier, but also just in general, like, innovation starts at the smallest stage at the bottom, and those companies tend to still raise from VC, right? How does that big number make an impact, to the rest of us? And I guess, what was your take on all of these commitments?
All right, I think there are a few different things of commitments that need to be looked at, right? There's the funds you're talking about, there's loss and damage. There are a number of different funds that are being put together, and thankfully so. I also think that it's not a binary choice of like innovation coming from small startups versus giant amounts of money that need to be put towards scaled projects. I think it's all of this. And in many cases, this is not going to be totally true, I guess, but in many cases, we have the technology we need. We need to scale it. And that's where blended finance comes really like to play. We need to scale it globally. We need to scale it locally. We need to take it from a test somewhere to a commercial scale to a whole bunch of commercial scale deployments all over the globe. So at some level, I think blended finance becomes really critical for that scaling piece of things. And then there's the big picture side of things of like, we need companies, that are at the scale of the globe striding giants, of oil companies and of the giant auto OEMs and so forth. Like we need those companies to come out of the renewable world as well. And I think some of them have, if you look at wind, for example, you've got Vestas or Siemens or Gamesa or whatever that are these giant companies doing wind. The same thing needs to continue to be true as we scale things like battery technology, storage more broadly, I should say, not just batteries, but storage. Same thing needs to be true there, right? Like you take Energy Dome and the example I just gave, they're still relatively early stage. So now we need to scale them. And that's going to take tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to do to truly make a global dent. And that's going to be true across all sorts of technologies and companies. But it's happening too. I mean, if you go back to my 2 and 3 wheeler example, there's a company out of Taiwan called Gogoro. They have been expanding really, really quickly, doing shared mopeds with a battery swapping system, mopeds rather more broadly, but with a battery swapping system. And they're now, I think, in India and the Philippines. I believe they launched in Israel. So they have launched all over the place and are growing very quickly. They went public, I don't know, a year and a half ago, something like that. So companies are doing this, right? There are companies in all sorts of different pieces of climate tech, thinking broadly, that are scaling. So I guess I don't see it as like big chunks of money that are kind of going to sit around wondering what to do, and then little startups that need money. I think it's all of these things and more. Like we need to pour capital into all sides of the stack, and VC dollars aren't always going to be the right dollars for every project.
I heard your CEO, Don Lippert, on another podcast, the Entrepreneurs for Impact podcast, just a few weeks back, talking about this very thing. So if folks want to dig a little bit deeper into that, that was a great episode. I'll put it in the show notes.
Thank you, Gabriel, for breaking that down. I guess one other thing, since I know a large part of your focus is around mobility, a few things that stood out to me this COP. There was obviously a lot of excitement around shipping this year. So there was a commitment, I think it was 30 shipping industry leaders, basically to take on renewable hydrogen as a shipping mechanism. That seemed relevant, given that it's a pretty significant impact globally, and I don't hear it getting talked about as much compared to some of the other drama. Did that cross your radar at all?
I guess the short answer is yes. I mean, the maritime side of things, huge opportunity and also a huge question mark still. And that signal of commitment towards hydrogen to me is a really interesting one, because I've been digging into the space for the last couple, I guess, year and a half, try to see where it goes. And candidly, I think it's still a space that's wide open for innovation. I mean, Maersk is pushing a lot. There are a lot of companies trying to understand where it goes. And, there's sort of bridge solutions like carbon capture on the vehicle, or on the vessel rather. There are companies that are pushing behavior change and algorithmic behavior change. So for example, we've got a portfolio company called Signal, which is doing that. Super interesting. They're essentially giving pilots guidance on how to drive the boat a bit differently in a way that reduces fuel. And then there are also obviously sort of the replacement questions around what are the drop-in replacements where you don't have to replace the whole fleet, and can hydrogen play a role like that? Can batteries play a role? Can sails? Obviously, a number of companies are now piloting new styles of sails. I think all of those things are definitely things that we need to invest more in. But yeah, I think that was an interesting signal as regards hydrogen specifically. And candidly, maritime might be one of the better use cases I've seen for actually using hydrogen for a form of mobility. I think right now I'm more bullish on hydrogen as a storage medium than I am on using it for mobility. Certainly, I just don't see it in, I could be proven wrong, but I don't see it in auto or auto-like vehicles because it just doesn't seem like the value is quite there. But maritime might be a use case that actually makes sense for it.
distribution of hydrogen, obviously a real challenge, but if you're really only refueling at some of the biggest ports, it makes it easier. I love the sail technology that we're seeing and some of the kite technology. I think, for thousands of years, this is what we use to power ships. And when you combine it with the latest weather satellite data that we have, I think that it's really promising as a way to augment and make ships more efficient as they move across the vast expanse of ocean.
Totally agree. Yep, totally agree.
Gabriel, I agree with you too on the sort of perils of hydrogen. Also, there's of course the hydrogen rainbow, which has embodied within it various carbon impacts. For me, the one that's been exciting to watch on that front, less so on COP, is though I'm sure they had a presence there, was Amazon and their climate pledge fund. Obviously they're trying to decarbonize their operations through investing, and one of their portfolio companies, Verne, just recently announced a breakthrough where they were able to demonstrate a semi truck capable of basically being powered on hydrogen, which to me signals that like there is potentially a pathway there. But I agree, it is by and large a large thing. It is hard to put it places and keep it safe and transportable. So it was just interesting to me that it came up during COP. Given all the sort of focal points on fossil fuels, I think hydrogen kind of took a backseat, at least from the outside.
The one thing I'd flag on hydrogen that I've been really keen to understand more about is white hydrogen, or gold, which is the naturally occurring kind. And I'm sure you saw there was news, I don't know, 3 months ago.
The big deposit, right?
In France. Yeah. Super, super interesting. And sort of what I saw after that was the suggestion that, that was just one of many, and it's probably global, and there are probably lots of such things. So then the question becomes, can you figure out a way to capture and store it and transport it? And to your point, Gregory, I mean, that's one of the tricks, right? Is how do we transport hydrogen in a way that's responsible and that doesn't cause further problems? I've come across some startups recently doing some pretty interesting work there that, if they succeed, could be fascinating and open up a whole new world of possible with white or gold hydrogen. But yeah, you're right, Jonathan. The rainbow is a real thing. And actually touching on one other thing, you mentioned sort of the Amazon side of things. You probably also saw the Bezos Earth Fund pledge. They pledged $100 million towards the Pacific, and specifically trying to do marine protection and so forth. So really interesting to see, back to sort of the beginning of this, how different players showed up to COP and different commitments that were made and the different ways that, again, multilateral institutions, NGOs, funds, banks, all these different entities are playing a role. And that to me was, again, kind of the takeaway from COP was just, wow, so many people invested in so many different ways and so much more to do. But man, there are a lot of people trying.
I want to dig into this a little bit deeper. A lot of commitments, a lot of numbers flying around. What's the process for actually monitoring and evaluating the progress towards the spending? It's one thing to make the commitment, to get excited. It's like an auction. Everyone's raising the paddle, but then you actually have to go and write the check. Yep. So how do we know that all these commitments are going to be followed through on? And as a more casual observer of this, how could someone evaluate like, oh, well, we made a commitment that we're going to do this much money in 3 years, and someone else is like, our commitment's over 5 years, and another is our commitment's over 10 years. So it makes it really hard. Was there a conversation about the sort of the monitoring of fulfillment on those commitments?
That's a great question. I did not hear that conversation come up. And I think it raised the other question. You used the metaphor of let's write a check, or not a metaphor, I guess the actual, but who's there to receive the check as well, right? So when you're talking about some of this stuff, how do you connect those dots of the person or entities writing the checks to the entities that need to receive them? And some of them are obvious, like loss and damage. That becomes somewhat obvious. There are going to be so many negotiations around how that kind of money gets divvied up. But certainly it's something that's a little more obvious than something like committing whatever hundreds of millions of dollars towards scaling technologies. Like, that's going to have somewhere to go through. And there are organizations that do that, right? Breakthrough is a great example of somebody who does that at scale. There are lots of organizations like that. So I think to some degree, it's sort of like, this is our bread and butter. This is what we do. So we write checks and we write them to these kinds of organizations to do this kind of work. And then some of it, yeah, you're right. I don't know how much monitoring. I guess that's where the press comes in, and that's where people who actually watch this and pay attention and make sure that we know what's actually happening are critical to the process.
Can we go back to battery technology for a minute? So I had another guest on this podcast that came out recently, Alexandra Ilyaditsa, and we actually talked a little bit about batteries or I should say energy storage, and only a very little bit. But there are so many different solutions here, from chemical batteries to mechanical batteries to pumped hydro.
Yep.
Were there any real innovative energy storage solutions that you heard about while you were at COP28?
I would say I continually hear about innovative approaches to battery, or to rather storage technologies. I think the question there is sort of the scale question of, like, who can prove it? Who can scale it? How quickly can we scale it? Does it require rare earths? Does it require any kind of strange processes? Is it something where we can basically take stuff we have on hand, give or take, and quickly deploy it? It just needs to be reconfigured. That's actually back to Energy Dome again, the company that we work with. Their approach that's so brilliant is that they largely take existing stuff off the shelf and they reconfigure it to create these domes that take compressed CO2 and take it from liquid to gas and back again. And that's the storage medium. Super interesting. And the thing that's exciting about it, and was one of the reasons we invested, was because it's not something where you have to go to Chile and dig something, or to some, country in Africa or whatever. It is something where you can take off the shelf technology for the most part and tie it together in a new way and rethink it as a storage medium. And I think that's something that's really exciting. Hydrogen is another one where, we talked about hydrogen a bit already, but to me, hydrogen could be a great storage medium. And if you've got, the Orkney Islands, for example, are a great example of where they've got excess power coming from renewables. The question then becomes, well, what do we do with it? Well, maybe you create hydrogen and you use that hydrogen as a storage medium to do other things. So I think that's where we're headed, is all sorts of different technologies that you deploy in different scenarios based on what you have at hand.
Mm-hmm.
But to your question, I didn't come across any dramatically new crazy technology at COP that stood out as a storage medium.
Other than Energy Dome, do you have any other companies in your portfolio that are doing energy storage?
We do, but not quite in that way. STEM is one of our portfolio companies. There are others that do charging based on a storage medium. So, for example, Spark Charge and FreeWire are two companies that use, in the case of Spark Charge, portable batteries to do charging for EVs. In the case of FreeWire, they are fast deploy battery or battery-driven charging technology for cars. So some really interesting companies that way. But other than that, in terms of storage in the way that you're describing it, no, I think Energy Dome is... Yeah, go ahead.
Not like grid level storage, essentially. No. These are more for like EV charging networks and things like
Correct.
that.
Yep.
Okay, so it's interesting. It's just I keep coming back to this idea of like how we perceive it from the outside, like the whole event versus like what it must have been like there. And I think of metaphors like you travel. If you're a fan of traveling, sometimes you might find that the fear factor of a certain place is inflated, and then you go there and maybe it's not so scary. Yep. I think like COP probably had a healthy...
Like Seattle, if you watch exactly. Fox News, you're like, I'm not going to Seattle, but come on, it's nice.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a great comparison. And, with COP, I'm trying to juxtapose like what I heard, and I want to get to like more of like what it was like. And so like an example, we talked about hydrogen. The other thing that came up was fusion. Now, I'm fortunate to work with a nuclear engineer, and, I've heard that it might be a little more overhyped than is warranted, but then again, it's taken headlines. And so you were on the ground. Was fusion something that came up? Did you feel like it was of the same magnitude as maybe some of us were hearing on the outside?
Fusion, yeah. Nuclear is definitely a thing that's being talked about, and it's one of those things where like lots of money, lots of interest. If the breakthrough happens, like changes the game, right? Fundamentally changes the game. But will it happen? We don't quite yet know. So I think, I don't know. I wouldn't bet against humanity. We're pretty smart. We figure stuff out. If there's a way to do it, I suspect we'll figure that out. And I actually think it could come sooner than later, but that's less informed an opinion than I would like to share. So I'll say simply, yes, people are definitely talking about it. It's definitely a thing that would be awesome if we could figure out. I don't have any new secret insight knowledge on that one. It's man, like if humanity could figure that out, it'd be unbelievable. I mean, it's similar actually to the white hydrogen or gold hydrogen, right? If it's truly everywhere and you can use it like in vast quantities, that could also be really interesting. Like there are so many things that can solve some of these problems for us. And I do think humanity's brilliant, and AI maybe frankly is going to be a trick that helps us get there faster, right? I mean, I just read the other day that something like 330 something new forms of crystal have been identified. They could be useful in renewables and batteries and other things that like, fundamental new things that we haven't thought of before that AI is going to help us think of. So there's some innovation happening that I think is going to be dramatically exciting over the next number of years. I have to admit, there was a point somewhere in the middle of COP where it's like, it is the most exciting time to be alive. Like there's so much potential to solve so many of these very real problems in a way that actually help everybody, that is truly, a just transition. Like there's so many things that could open up the world to all sorts of almost free energy and, all the potential that comes with that. So I left feeling very excited, not to wrap on that, but like just at the potential right now.
Yeah, it seems like, and I've read accounts of that sort of feeling of just immense excitement of the potential. And I share in your sentiment, Gabriel, around like how exciting of a time it is. It's often said about step change innovation that like you can't really predict it. It's almost like being in a bubble. You don't know you're in a bubble until you're in hindsight, right? You don't know
until
that the engine
pops.
Until it pops. You don't know the engine is going to have the impact, until suddenly you're stuck riding a horse and watching the cars fly by. And I feel like something like one of these technologies you saw, it's almost like a glimpse past that like bubble line, right? Like we still don't know what it's going to be. Like maybe it is one of these big hydrogen deposits that suddenly makes the price of oil go to zero. But like, I guess that is what is in the air right now. We've just got this buffet of options, and they all seem to be marching forward irrespective of each other.
Yeah, irrespective, but I think that's right. That's what has to happen right now, because we don't know, right? And so we have to keep seeding all of them. We have to keep funding all of them. We have to keep them going and giving them the policy pushes they need and so forth. That was one thing. So I obviously we're talking about COP. Just before COP, I was at a conference called Slush in Helsinki, and that one more heavily European. Both of them, but especially that one, a lot of the talk was around, holy cow, the IRA has fundamentally changed the global landscape. Like it obviously changed the US landscape in terms of the renewables and mobility, obviously EVs and so forth, but like huge changes there for industry in the US, like biggest piece of industrial policy and who knows how long. And the changes it has wrought are just at the very beginnings, like the tip of what we're going to see from what that bill did in a really incredibly positive way. But the interesting thing is, talking to folks from outside the US, they see it in much the same way. It's game-changing for the US. It's game-changing for them too. It's forcing other governments to step up and say, oh, like we've got to do this too. And China, in a lot of ways, has been ahead, right? Like if you look at solar, you look at battery technology, you look at EVs, the EVs in particular, where China's at with EVs, they are so far ahead of the US in a lot of ways on this, in a way that I'm not sure the US auto industry quite understands yet.
They already have boneyards of thousands of abandoned EVs.
Yeah.
They're far ahead in that way as well. But you're right, bringing the price down to a level where people can afford them and where they're so cheap that people can take the first gen out of service and just mothball them, and the second generation or third generation is already out there on the streets.
Right. And the thing we're seeing now, I mean, Europe is already getting a lot of the little Chinese electric vehicles. They're already rolling in. The US so far, not so much. It's interesting to see how that is changing the conversation. To your point, I mean, Gregory, yes, they've brought the prices down. I mean, the new Cybertruck versus a Chinese small EV, you can get a Chinese small EV for less than $10,000. New Cybertruck's what, 60,000, 70,000? That's not accessible to most people, or, without significant debt. And so I think there's a lot to be said there. But anyway, back to the reflection on the conversations that I had those two conferences, just the amount of sort of change people saw from the IRA and how much it's pushed the rest of the world's conversation forward as well. Everything from what are our governments doing to, wow, we need to look at setting up shop in the US. It is fostering so much innovation, so much push forward. And Jonathan, back to your sort of point on all of it, like all these things are marching forward irrespective. There's so many people pushing so many ideas forward that to me, it feels like, wow, like things are breaking through, and it's going to keep going, and it's going to keep accelerating, and it's just going to speed up the change.
I want to stop for 1 second. You said IRA. Just for the listeners, that's the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed last year in the United States and has funded a tremendous amount of investment, $360 billion over the next 10 years, I think is the number, in climate-related sustainability, innovation, and deployment, correct?
Correct.
Get that
And
basically right? Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of it is yet to come out, right? So, some of it came through the IRS, a lot of it came through tax code and tax policy, and there's guidance from that that's still not entirely clear on how people access the fund. Then there are other things like the EPA has their Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and that's $27 billion fund, $14 billion of which will be allotted, as I understand it, sometime this next spring for organizations working to scale up climate tech startups. So so much money, so much effort to change things. And it's going to setting aside climate, it's going to set the US up with its economy for the next, how many generations. This is fundamentally reworking the whole economy. And with it, hopefully creating a dramatic opportunity to fight against climate change. So to me, part of the excitement here is this is the biggest business opportunity of our lifetimes. It is also, as it happens, an opportunity to save humanity and the place that we live. Right. These things are conveniently related in this case. So it's quite an interesting and exciting time from my perspective.
So as we move towards the end of our time together, I know I have one or two last questions I want to ask. So I'm going to give Jonathan the heads up that he can think of his one or two closing questions or comments. But from what you saw at these two conferences and where you sit today versus the last time you were on the podcast, I have to ask, as a career coach, what do you see as the opportunities for people who want to get into the climate solutions space on the business side? So not the engineers, not the software developers, not the scientists, but folks that want to do things like product management and finance and marketing. What opportunities do you see?
We're talking about
what advice would you have?
Yeah, we're talking about climate tech businesses. So at the end of the day, just like any other business, they need those roles, right? They need to be able to tell their story. I think storytelling is critical. So when you talk about marketing, I think that's critical. These companies need to get out there and let people know this is what we're solving. This is how we're solving it. These are the opportunities in our technology and in our company. Finance, we already talked a lot about that in this podcast. They need for people who understand really deeply finance is going to do nothing but grow, right? As companies realize they need to take on more blended finance, they need to take on a lot of different finance or financial mechanisms. They're going to need people who are sophisticated in how they look at those, how they understand them, what access they have to different types of capital is going to be critical. And so I think tremendous opportunities there. I would say that just like any other job or sort of hunt for your career, it's taking what you're good at and what you love doing and applying it to a technology or an idea or a team that you really get excited about. And so I'm a big believer in the team. I'm a big believer in finding people where you feel like, wow, we've got a mission. We can march together on something like this. But again, I think climate tech and climate solving, many of the challenges related to climate is not only the biggest sort of save humanity piece of opportunity of our lifetimes, but it's also the biggest business opportunity we'll see in our lifetime. So if you're somebody coming out of your MBA program or whatever, there's an opportunity out there for you. It's just a matter of do lots of informational interviews, find out what's happening, see what you get excited about. What do you care about technology-wise, community-wise? Where do you want to work? Much the same advice I would give anybody pursuing any kind of career. But in this case, I think the world is massively open for this kind of, technology and companies and work.
That's awesome, Gabriel. I've been trying to think, okay, so what would be, I think, a question that could tie career to your learnings at COP and some of the things we've talked about during our time here. And I think, so I'm thinking of like a specific anecdote. I was in San Francisco recently and I was in a lift and I met a young man who was displaced from Ukraine. When he was, before being displaced, he was a materials engineer. He did research. He's on patents. He was quite enterprising. He started a few gyms. Then he ended up in San Francisco on the promise of a sort of materials engineering job that fell through. It was sort of impacted by the dearth of layoffs we're seeing, throughout this year, but certainly in recent history as well. And I was talking to him about maybe working in climate. And by any measure, someone like this should be very qualified, but he was having a hard time thinking about it, thinking about where to start. And of course, I could offer any number of job boards, but I did find myself thinking about what I get asked a lot, which is like, what's exciting to you? What's available to work in right now? I suppose I could ask you that, Gabriel, but I also feel like because you were a cop, you saw something that not a lot of us saw, which was where all the money's going. And I think if you're looking for a job right now and you want stability and maybe not to be impacted by layoffs, maybe you should start thinking about where that IRA money is going, in early next year, or some of these commitments out of COP. So instead of just asking you, Gabriel, what's exciting to you, where do you think the money's going? And where do you think this, like this individual I'm bringing up or others who have potential to impact climate tech companies in a meaningful way, where should they be looking to capture some of this money that's coming into climate and climate technologies?
That's a great question. I don't think there is no lack of areas that the money is flowing towards climate tech. Energy storage, transmission, distribution, anything that's moving the needle there's going to be huge opportunity. I mean, one gap is workforce development, right? So we can talk a lot about how we're going to implement all this stuff, but at the end of the day, if you can't get a contractor to put the HVAC system in the house, that's a gap. So it's everything from the contractor side, sort of getting out there and actually screwing screws into walls and putting things in basements and whatnot, all the way up to being a solar developer or being a developer of some other sort. And that's the financial network side. I think the money will follow all of these gaps, as money often does. And from my perspective, there are gaps all over the place. So Jonathan, I don't think there's one quick and easy answer. I think that more to the point, the IRA has pointed the way towards growth industries for the next 50 to 100 years. But also that's, the world's needs are pointing that way, whether it's energy storage, whether it's energy distribution, whether it's changing the landscape. I mean, think about, again, to mobility. If this country moves significantly towards electric vehicles, which I think we are, and I don't think it's hard to imagine that rolling back, it's going to change fundamentally the landscape of the people who deal with those vehicles, whether it's selling them, fixing them, charging them. And that also is a growth opportunity, right? So organizations working in any of those spaces, training people to do the jobs that'll maintain those cars. What does the service network look like? What does the charging network look like? Who's building that? I mean, Pilot just made an announcement of chargers they're putting in at their long haul stations. Like there's so many different areas where growth is happening and is going to continue accelerating as we move through this transition. And the transition is not going to stop in our lifetimes or the lifetimes of our kids, or I don't know, probably not even the grandkids. It's going to be a long time. And so I think that there is growth all over the place again. And you brought this up. Like, what are you passionate about? What do you care about? And just to go back to the example of the person you mentioned, he had worked in or owned a gym and done some other stuff. Like maybe for him, it's about human health and how that ties to climate, right? And there are all sorts of angles you could take caring about human health and climate, because that's a huge thing. So I don't see there being any one or two or three or five areas. I think there's areas everywhere. And figure out what's your passion. How do you follow it? And look at what the IRA is pushing. Look at where you're seeing big announcements made, whether it's out of COP or other. That to me is kind of where it all goes. I don't know if I gave you an answer to your question, but hopefully that at least touches on some directions for folks.
I think it's probably one of those questions that has a million right answers. So I'm just happy to hear your take on it. And it's certainly something I'll be watching and trying to read the tea leaves on myself.
Gabriel, I want to thank you again for having this conversation on careers and professional life. Where can people find out more about you and about Elemental Accelerator?
Elemental is easy. That's ElementalExcelerator.com, and of course on social as well. And I guess for me, I'm on LinkedIn, and at this point, that's about it.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Thank you again for taking the time today, Gabriel.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Gabriel Scheer and Jonathan Azoff. Look for more episodes featuring Jonathan as my co-host coming in 2024. Thank you for listening to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or classmate. Help others find the show by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Conversations on Careers and Professional Life is produced by me, Gregory Heller. with support from the Foster School of Business Office of MBA Career Management. Learn more about the show, find show notes, and past episodes, and get in touch with me at conversationsoncareers.com. This episode was produced with editing and engineering support from Amelia Nguyen, a student in the Communication Leadership Master's Program at the University of Washington, and made possible in part with funding from SNØCAP, a venture capital firm investing in early-stage platforms that directly and indirectly solve the climate crisis. Learn more at snocap.vc. That's SNOCAP.vc.